This is Dave Franchino, president of Delve, a design and innovation consultancy. And today it's my real pleasure to virtually chat with the founders of Badger Shield. As you'll learn shortly, Badger Shield is a really innovative partnership between the University of Wisconsin Innovation Lab, better known as the Makerspace, Midwest Prototyping, and Delve. And the initial goal and the real success, I think, of Badger Shield was to provide desperately needed face shields to the UW hospital, which they did via open source design just a couple of weeks ago. And it's now being manufactured across the globe, really across the country here and in Europe. So joining me are three of the individuals who are really key in that effort, and I'm looking forward to chatting with them about their experiences. Jesse Darley, the Director of Mechanical Engineering at Delve, Lennon Rodgers, the Director of the UW Innovation Lab, and Brian Ellison, who's the Business Development Manager at Midwest Prototyping. They're all on the call. So welcome, everybody, and thanks very much for taking time in this really stressful time to chat with me.
Thank you.
Lennon, maybe you could chat with us about how this all began. My understanding this began with a request from the UW hospital. Is that right? Tell me how this all got started.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's hard to kind of go back and put it in context of what was going on. So I think if everyone goes back, it was a little over 3 weeks ago now. It was on a Monday. And at that time, there were just a lot of rumblings about what was going on. It was really weird, and I'd never experienced anything like it, where schools were likely going to be closed and the university might be closed and we might need to go get groceries and all this kind of thing. And in that backdrop, I received this email from UW Health, and they said that they were in desperate need of 1,000 shields is the number they used at the time, face shields. But it was just kind of in my email queue, and I didn't really have too much time to look into it because for the most part, we were thinking about these other rumblings going on about childcare needs and other things. Because my wife was an anesthesiologist, she would most likely continue to work, and so we'd have to figure that out. And so that was kind of the start of it, was receiving that email.
Interesting. And then how did you get Jesse involved? I think that's one of the next steps, or at some point Jesse kind of got involved in an open source design. How did this consortium start to come together?
Yeah, that is an interesting part. So that Monday night, I think we pretty much had the kids going to bed, and I said, I had mentioned to my wife as kind of through that evening process about this email, and she confirmed having her connection as an anesthesiologist. She said, yeah, actually that is a real issue. I've heard of it too. And that kind of escalated the situation to me. And she had even mentioned a couple days ago before that about how she was mildly concerned and kind of the reality of being someone that will be intubating patients and just the amount of contact she would have with the virus. So that night, on Monday night, I went out and created a prototype, just going through Home Depot. I think anyone that works in the prototyping world, that's where they're most comfortable. I'm most comfortable going through the aisles, throwing things in the cart. And so I went through to Home Depot and to the craft store and did that. And so that night I created a prototype at the Makerspace, got some feedback from my wife. But to get to your question about Jesse and Brian, that was kind of the next morning. And I sent out an email and said, hey, I replied to UW Health, and I said, hey, here's a quick prototype. And I also reached out to Jesse and Brian through a suggestion of a colleague here. I had met Jesse many times. We'd become friends over the last few years. Brian, I had seen give a talk at Delve, but we hadn't met. And so that really formed out of my understanding of the strengths of Delve and strengths of Midwest Prototyping, and knowing that was the only way we were going to actually be able to scale this up. And so that was kind of how it happened.
Jesse, I know you turned around a design for the shield that really ended up kind of catching fire and became sort of an open source prototype for virtually all of the shield designs that I've seen out there. I was just kind of curious, how'd you go about turning that around quickly, and what were the considerations you used in trying to determine how this shield might be constructed?
So Brian and Len and I had a quick call to really discuss what we thought the design parameters were and the functional needs were, but we were kind of at a loss. And since Midwest Prototyping is a 3D printing service bureau, our minds first went to, should we be creating some sort of frame that we can 3D print and then attach some plastic to? And I said, well, you know what? I really know nothing about this. We need to start with the user. And so Brian and I often meet at a golf course in town where the dogs can run around. And one of the other dogs there, besides our two dogs, the owner of that dog works at the UW hospital. And she went and she grabbed one of the face shields that the anesthesiologist used down there and dropped it at my house. And I looked at that and I got on another call with Brian and Lennon and said, hey, this is what I'm seeing. It's really just three materials, foam, elastic, and clear plastic. Is this the way we should go? Because it's going to really match what they are using now. So between that conversation and another call with Brian where we went to McMaster Carr and found equivalent materials that we could order overnight, that's how the design quickly evolved from a little bit of reverse engineering and a little bit of design for manufacturing and assembly that we knew that we could do quickly. And that night I got a drawing together and I talked to Lennon and said, do you think it's too premature to put this online so that everything we've learned in this quick day or so we can share with the rest of the world? And so that's what we did. And we had a prototype based on that McMaster materials the next day that we were able to take down to the hospital and get their feedback. And then they were able to take that and get it approved for us to start making these for them.
Brian, one thing that has really impressed me has been how Midwest Prototype has really stepped up during the midst of this crisis in so many different ways. I mean, I know that beyond Badger Shield, you're helping a wide variety of firms across a variety of fronts. But one of the things that really impressed me about your response in Badger Shield is that you looked outside of your typical capabilities and your typical core competencies to provide assistance in a way that was unique. And, you know, I think there's an old saying that if you own a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And when many people think of Midwest Prototyping, they might think of a firm that does 3D printing, yet the shield design was very, very successful simply because it was able to use scaling methodologies that don't require the abilities of 3D printing. Well, what were you able to do to kind of get Midwest Prototype in a position to be able to assist with this particular project?
First and foremost, I think it was a really great opportunity for people to see what we truly do at a higher level. I mean, I think that sometimes we get sort of branded as the FedEx office of 3D printing. And so from that standpoint, you know, people are like, well, we send you a drawing, you print it, and you send it back to us. You know, for us, you know, we really look at ourselves as a solutions provider. And, you know, a lot of times in prototyping, 3D printing makes that solution, but we also work in a lot of other ways, working with customers and clients and building solutions that aren't always an additive manufacturing solution. So this was really a nice chance for us to be able to jump in at the ground level and really do the tenets that Jesse and I talked about in our presentation that Lennon participated in, which is we were able to work very early on in the design phase to build out solutions that may or may not require different things that we bring in, but we can bring those teams together and build those teams and create really elegant, successful solutions quickly. We were able to jump in really quickly on this one because, you know, there was the ability to sort of source very quickly from McMaster, which is we work with them and get, you know, we're getting stuff in on a daily basis from them for different parts for prototyping. We also knew that, you know, besides additive manufacturing, we also have the ability for other manufacturing subtractive. So whether it's CNC, whether it's laser cutting, things like that. And so we were able to get our laser cutter to quickly make some prototypes for the lenses and put things together quickly that way. And then from there, it was just sort of this quick recognition by our founder, Steve Grundle, that this is something that was not going to slow down, and it was going to be a tremendous need, and that really the benefit is that it's something that we could grow sort of next to our business as a small business, and it doesn't take the capacity of our 3D printers. So we could still be working with our 3D printing customers while we're doing another project, and we basically set up an entire facility in Mount Horeb now, where we have a whole separate team that's building face shields. And as we move into other products and projects with the medical device and medical sort of PPE equipment, if it doesn't require additive manufacturing, we've got a team now that can just focus on that.
I don't know, maybe this is directed at Lennon. One of the things that's both inspiring and at the same time heartbreaking for those of us who are in the creative innovation space is to see all of the efforts out on the internet where very, very well-intentioned people are working really hard to create innovative solutions to the really dire problems we're facing. And many of those solutions, although well-intentioned, aren't really delivering into the marketplace. I'm just kind of curious why you feel that the Badger Shield effort really kind of hit the sweet spot of fitting a need in the marketplace and really being able to deliver solutions, as opposed to kind of dying on the vine as many other initiatives kind of seem to be.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Something I wouldn't have been able to answer in the moment, but I think I've had some time to reflect on it. And I mean, going back in hindsight, and I still remember the time when Jesse and Brian and I were talking about it. I was in my car and we were trying to shuffle our kids off to do various things. And we were basically like, you know, right now, everyone out there is basically, for the most part, 3D printing these face shields. And we had this discussion quickly, everything that Jesse and Brian have said about human-centered design that we're all pretty well trained in. And it just didn't make any sense to us. There was something in our gut in that discussion. So that was kind of one turning point. That one was pretty clear. I think the thing that definitely wasn't at the time I was aware of, which really, and to me, was related, but why the Badger Shield caught on fire was that 3D printing, though a lot of people have 3D printers, what ended up really catching on was these small to medium-sized factories across the country and really across the world that I think when you look at a 3D printed design, even given all the limitations we talked about of throughput and other things, they don't have them. And so I'll give you an interesting example of these small to medium-sized factories that saw the design and they said, hey, actually, we could do that. Like, that's something we could do. And that's really where we got some resonance. And as an example, there's a factory in my hometown called Wall Clipper. And I'll rewind a little bit before that, is that my parents had called and found out about Badger Shield and they said, hey, could you send some to the local hospital? And I'm like, well, you know, we're kind of trying to prioritize those in most need. And I felt a little bad because, you know, I can't, reply to that request. But I was like, have the hospital fill out the intake form. And so I got off the phone with them and then I checked my email and Jesse had received an email from this factory in my hometown, Wall Clipper. And they had said, hey, we saw your design and we're tooling up to make thousands of them. And I was like, wow, amazing. And so I sent an email back to my parents and said, hey, actually, Wall Clipper is already making them. And so that, to me, was the first time I really saw that resonance of this design, was that even though it happened to be in my hometown, they didn't know that I was from that town. There were these factories out there that were retooling very quickly because they also saw that it was something that had a lot of manufacturing capability and ability to be manufactured at large scale. So it's kind of that large scale manufacturing component. I think that is really what spread. In 3D printing, as you mentioned, is a really good tool, but we realized pretty early on that it wasn't the appropriate tool in this case if you're thinking mass production.
You talked about the intake form. Tell me a little bit more about that, because I think one of the real magical things this team did was your distributed effort to align manufacturing and production. I thought or manufacturing and demand. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it was when I was coming back early on, just maybe a couple of days after we started this project. I was coming from Midwest and the light bulb went off in my head. I'm like, man, we need to get a website ASAP. And so I called our operations manager here at the Makerspace and says, hey, Maggie, can you set up a website? We need to get an intake form. We need to start collecting people that are looking for shields. We need to get people that are making shields. And at the same time, I think it came maybe a day later or so, as I realized we really need a database, a list of supply chain options for people, because that's going to be a choking point. And so, yeah, that ended up being a huge part of our focus, was trying to make those connections.
Jesse and Brian, you used a phrase recently that I'd not heard before, pop-up manufacturing. Tell me a little bit more about that in the context of this, and what implications you think that might have even for beyond this crisis, perhaps.
Yeah, Dave, I got that from Lennon, whose partner Justin is using it, and he says basically it's something that really defines this middle tier, and what Badger Shield is all about. So if you think of maybe 3 tiers of creation, the maker that's using their basement 3D printer to make a couple for their wife or aunt that's a nurse. Then you have the traditional supply chain, which is everything is moved offshore and it's basically ground to a halt because of exports and demand in China for face shields and masks. And so we're thinking of this 250 and growing list of manufacturers that are making the Badger Shield as a pop-up supply chain, which really was facilitated by that intake form that Dunn talked about. So, you know, these are companies, you can sort of think of it as a wartime economy that are retooling. Ford is the most, maybe the highest profile of the partners that we're working with. But I think it may be the new normal, and it's what, if we can understand, and this happens to be kind of a regulated environment, I think it's going to happen in all classes of the consumer economy, that will have these crazy demands popping up and these breaks in the traditional supply chain that needs to be solved with this pop-up supply chain.
Brian, maybe a question for you. One of the questions I'm sure some of our listeners will have concerns the legal liability associated with producing products in this very chaotic environment. I've really been impressed that this team has done the right thing and put the needs of the healthcare workers first, but I'm sure that had to be a consideration for you and your team. For other manufacturers who might be considering getting involved in this or other PPE programs, what lessons do you have, or what advice might you have relative to the legal ramifications of getting involved in these sorts of efforts?
First and foremost, I think that, you know, we have to take a minute and pause and recognize that we're probably in one of the few moments, or maybe the only moment we'll ever have in our lifetime, where the public need is basically greater than the need of bureaucracy to control it. And so we are in sort of a unique situation in that way. I think, you know, we've been asked this, and you know, we looked, you know, a couple things I think were key that made this a success and allowed us to move forward quickly from sort of the liability standpoint. Number one is we chose a product that, having worked with the medical community, we understood it as being something that was not needing to be sanitized, was not needing to meet really high level FDA clearance. Lennon was able to secure pretty early on the videos, the donning videos that show how healthcare workers were supposed to be putting on all of their equipment. And we saw that this shield was the last thing that they put on. So after they put on all their gowns, their gloves, their masks, that's what then the shield would go on. And so from that standpoint, we didn't have to create something in a clean room environment that was going to have, you know, huge liability ramifications later on because of the performance of the operation of the materials that were part of the face shield. You know, and I think that, you know, that's really sort of the kind of dovetails right in the second point, which is we worked with the hospital, we worked with the healthcare community right away. This wasn't, hey, I've got this idea, we can create a face shield, and then we started creating one, putting it out online and talking to people about how we're going to create face shields. It was, hey, you know, Lennon, you know, was able to connect us obviously very quickly with his wife, an anesthesiologist, but then also with the hospital system. And what we found was overwhelming support from not just the doctors and the people on the front lines, but from the purchasing agents and from the administration to, put together quick meetings and, everything from meeting on the loading dock in the hospital to try out some equipment to being able to drop off a face shield and within 15 minutes get a call back from the head of purchasing to say, yeah, let's move forward with this. We like it. But can you change, one thing with the foam, or can we make, the curve on the bottom of the lens a little bit less sharp? And those were all things that we could do very quickly. And I feel like we created a whole environment of trust, that everybody was working for the same common goal and that we could make mistakes. It wasn't that we were going to, if we made one mistake or there was one hiccup, that everybody was going to go start looking in different directions. It was the trust that we were going to work through this together and bring this out to this common solution. And I don't think the UW was doing this because they didn't have any other choices. I think they just recognized that we were the ones that sort of had put together the best program.
Brian had mentioned the recommendation that you charge a fair market price rather than donate the shield. Why that advice to potential manufacturers?
Number one is, it's when you're on your, I guess the analogy would be was when you're on the plane and, if the oxygen mask drop down, you put your mask on first and then you help those around you. I think that there are a lot of people doing a lot of great sort of humanitarian efforts of like, we hear people building face shields and masks and donating them and giving them away. I think that that's fantastic that people are doing that. I think the reality is that we wanted to make sure that we were creating an economic model that people would be incentivized to continue making face shields. So it doesn't become one of these that like, oh, we'll do this for now, but when business goes back to usual, or when we're not when we're recognizing that we're not able to make our employees payroll, that we've got to shift back to doing something else because that's what pays the bills. That there should be economic incentive throughout this process for people to produce the products that are needed for healthcare workers.
Excellent. Maybe one last question to the entire team. What advice would you have to other manufacturers, other product designers who see needs and are trying to solve them? It might be through Badger Shield, it might be through other PPEs, it might be in other unrelated efforts. What are the major lessons you think contribute to the success of this particular effort?
So I think I think everyone would agree, because this kind of summarizes our process, is that, work with the hospital. That was definitely key to what we did. Create a team. You're not going to be able to do it alone. I think the team is even beyond the ones here. I mean, we created through a Slack channel a huge group of 100 people in the Madison area, just making connections.
I really want us to remember that this is a worldwide problem, and there's a potential for this pop-up manufacturing chain to solve the same needs in the developing world. And so if there's a way to get some of these designs like Badger Shield out a little bit further, hopefully we can do even more good. And I think we've talked about it a little bit, but I think not just finished goods supply chains are breaking down, but the raw material supply chains are breaking down. So after you've figured out, if you want to get involved and you feel like that you have the healthcare workers giving you the thumbs up on your design, really before you get too far, make sure that you can get the materials you need, because if those break down, then you really have nothing if you can't make stuff. So it's really an end-to-end process, and you need to think through all the steps before you get too far ahead of ourselves. Not that we didn't do that. I think we kind of started sprinting before we realized all these things.
I think that's a good point. I mean, the supply chain is like the failure mode, it seems like. I mean, and this is all it goes for Ford too. It doesn't matter how much money and resources you have. I was on a lot of the phone calls with Ford for various suppliers, and it was just like, we can't make that much. It would take us so long to ramp up machines, and they also had constraints related to COVID about staff being in facilities and things like that. So yeah, I totally agree.
Understand. Are you in a position to talk about what's next for Badger Shield?
Lennon, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, I think what's interesting, I guess, with Badger Shield is, I guess, what we looked at is that we went back to the hospital again and just said, well, what is another need that you guys have? And one of the top needs was for a device called a PAPR, which is essentially a more robust shield. In some ways, it's like a hood that goes over. It's like some type of hazmat suit. So that design has a lot of different parts to it. So it has a blower, it has some hoses, it has batteries, and it has the actual hood and among other things. So we have now quite a large team. I would say this team you're talking to now, plus a lot of the partners at Delve and Midwest, are focusing on the hood piece. But at UW-Madison, in Madison more broadly, there are other people working on other parts of the PAPR. And what's interesting too is we have a list of about 10 projects. I'm part of the College of Engineering, and we've assimilated a team that's really connecting to all the people in Madison and beyond. And so there are about 10 projects that are also going on in parallel in direct collaboration with the UW Hospital.
Lennon, thank you. And I guess to all three of you, thank you so very much for your efforts. It makes me proud to know you, and I think the country and society owes you a debt for the incredible effort that you've put out through this very, very difficult time. Once again, this is Dave Franchino, president of Delve. It's been my real pleasure to talk to three individuals who are core for starting up the Badger Shield effort, for developing a personal protective shield for hospital applications during the COVID crisis. He was joined by Jesse Darley, the director of mechanical engineering at Delve, Lennon Rodgers, the director of the UW Innovation Lab, and Brian Ellison, business development manager for Midwest Prototyping. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Good luck and keep yourselves safe, please.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Dave.